South Korea descended into political turmoil after its president, Yoon Suk-yeol, declared emergency martial law yesterday, saying he was acting to protect his country from threats posed by North Korea, and he accused the opposition of being anti-state forces. Then, reversing his decision, South Korean MPs have started impeachment proceedings against him. So how did we get to this point, and what is likely to happen next? Breaking it all down for us this morning is Kiri Paramore, Professor of Asian Studies at the Institute for Korean Studies at University College Cork. Good morning and welcome.
Oh, good morning, Pat.
Can you give us something of a timeline for these events? I mean, the president was in deep political trouble. For what?
Well, earlier this year, his party lost the parliamentary elections for the National Assembly. So the opposition Democratic Party, which is a left-wing party, they had a very big majority in Parliament. So he wasn't really able to get anything through. There was a whole bunch of corruption allegations, things involving his wife and so forth. And out of nowhere, last night at around midnight, he declared martial law. The army came out on the streets. Then the army came on the television, the army command telling people that politics is suspended. There were no gatherings of people were going to be allowed. No political meetings could be heard. Political parties would be disbanded and so forth. So for Koreans, any Korean over the age of 40, this was like a harking back to the old days of the brutal military dictatorship, which they'd grown up with in the 70s and 80s. So pretty scary stuff that happened last night.
Okay, now, when you refer back to the 70s and 80s, I mean, we look at South Korea now, we buy a lot of their products, Samsung and Hyundai and all of those brands that we're familiar with, and we would hate to think we were buying from a despotic regime. So everything seems to have changed in South Korea. What was it like back then?
Well, it's a very vibrant democracy now, but until 1987, it was a brutal military dictatorship where, people, for instance, when I was at the University of Tokyo in the early 2000s, about 20 of my fellow students would have been Koreans. Every single one of them had been tortured. Every single one of them had been interned by the military at some stage and tortured. So that's what it was like back then. And then in 1987, they democratized. In 1988, Kim Dae-jung, who'd been a great democracy activist, was elected, and they've had a very successful, very robust, very, very dynamic, but nonetheless a democracy ever since. And that's why what happened last night was scary, but it also sort of explains maybe why it happened, because everybody's asking, how could this happen? What was this guy thinking? What was the president thinking he could call martial law and disband political parties? But it's because he's from that generation, and maybe the Minister for Defence, a lot of people are mentioning that he may have come up with this idea, and they date back to that period. So the question was, how was Korean society going to react? What was going to happen? And luckily, as we've seen, the parliamentarians sort of really stood their ground, and a couple of hours later, happily, President Yoon, gave up this idea of martial law, and the army pulled back from the National Assembly. So now it remains to be seen what's going to happen now.
Now, the question of the army doing their president's bidding, clearly the high command of the army felt reasonably comfortable with this order, to the point that they went on television and they posted troops in various places. So where stands the military now? Are people a bit edgy that the military might have a taste for this?
Yeah, well, this is what is a little bit unsettling about what happened. Now, according to the Constitution, the president can declare martial law unilaterally, but on the other hand, the National Assembly, with a simple majority, can stop him doing that. What was a bit worrying last night was that the army tried to stop the members of the National Assembly from entering the National Assembly, which is unconstitutional. And the way the members, the MPs, the members of Parliament, got in is they basically sort of pushed their way in, climbed over fences and so forth. And then the army landed helicopters on the roof of the National Assembly and tried to force their way in. But by that stage, the staff of the National Assembly had physically barricaded the room. So now it's a bit like after what happened in the Capitol in Washington, D.C. during those riots back 4 years ago is now all these videos are emerging, and we're seeing that actually, the parliamentary staff actually did physically barricade and used fire extinguishers and stuff like this to create a smoke screen, and they basically stopped the army. Now, obviously, at that point, the army didn't use explosives. They didn't. Nobody was hurt. There was no use of firearms or explosives or anything like that. So I guess we'll have to wait to see exactly what happened. Yeah. But certainly on the one hand, the army, as you said, did the president's bidding. But on the other hand, when confronted by opposition, people yelling at them, people pushing back, they didn't use lethal force, for instance. So
the question is, was this plot hatched between the army top brass and the Minister for Defence, as well as the president? And if so, whose heads might roll? Or will the military, as I say, decide to do their own thing?
Well, it seems to be being pinned on the Minister for Defence at the moment. So the ruling party, what was really interesting was, as soon as he declared martial law, his own political party opposed martial law. His own Conservative political party opposed him literally within minutes of him announcing martial law, which shows they hadn't been consulted. And they then had a meeting this morning where they asked for the cabinet to resign. They didn't ask for the president to resign, interestingly, but they asked for the cabinet to resign, and they specifically mentioned that the Minister for Defence, well, I think he's gone, basically, right? So it's being pinned on the Minister for Defence. The head of the army came out and sort of said, well, all the army's doing now is just making sure nobody gets hurt. So he seems to be pulling back. So, and as far as the actual generals, what their involvement was, well, that's unclear at this stage.
Okay, now, how much trouble politically was President Yoon in before all of this? I mean, when we look at people around the world, we saw Bolsonaro now charged in Brazil, Netanyahu trying to evade justice by waging war in the Middle East, even Trump, having been convicted already, will escape any kind of sanction because of his political power, starting on January the 20th, but already actively using it. Was President Yoon likely to be indicted on some corruption charges?
Well, he was most certainly going to lose. Well, when I say most certainly, it looked very likely he was going to lose the election that's coming up. He's very unpopular. And so on the one hand, there's very little hope for him to win an election coming up. And in terms of his current position, he's president. He's been president for the last several months since he lost the parliamentary majority, but he hasn't been able to do anything. They've basically stopped him doing anything. So it's a sort of classical constitutional crisis where the executive, the president, and the legislature, the National Assembly in this case, basically can't agree on anything. And this martial law declaration seems to have been President Yoon's attempt to resolve this constitutional crisis, but obviously a very, very extreme strategy and one that appears not to have worked at all and seemingly to have backfired. It looks like he will now be either asked to resign or impeached, although that's developing this morning.
Yeah. Now, he invoked the bogeyman to the North Korea, in terms of his rationalization of his act. How do South Koreans react towards North Korea? Are people still technically at war with each other?
Yes, South Korea and North Korea are technically at war, and the way that right-wing politics has always worked in South Korea, as in most, as in most anti-communist countries, the right-wing parties will use the communist bogeyman to basically paint anybody they don't like as being sort of pro-communist or anti-state, and that's what he did. So in the announcement of martial law, he referred to North Korea. Obviously, there's no North Korean involvement with the parliamentary majority in South Korea. And then he just labelled the vast majority of the parliament of South Korea as anti-state. So it was just a very, very sort of primitive and old-fashioned attempt to use the communist bogeyman to sort of attack the left wing, which in this case is in the majority in South Korea at the moment.
So finally, Kiri, the question of how robust is Korean democracy? I mean, obviously this was a test. It seems to have passed the test at the moment.
Yeah, so far so good. It appears to have. It's really interesting too when you look at the pictures and stuff and you see that those members of parliament and parliamentary staffers who actually immediately began to barricade the building. And I was looking at the pictures, and they're people that are my age, in their in their 50s. They would have all had the experience of building barricades back during the 1980s. They would have all participated in these huge sort of street riots which occurred. It's not the first time in their lives they've had to sort of fight the army, and so they did it so quickly. So it's also sort of interesting to think, maybe part of the reason that the democracy was so robust and that they did push back so well is strangely enough because of their experience of having lived under a military regime before. And so they're so strong-willed that they're not going to have that again. They're not going to go back.
A sort of a political muscle memory. Anyway, Kiri, thank you very much for joining us. Kiri Paramore, Professor of Asian Studies at the Institute for Korean Studies at University College Cork. Thank you.